Professor Chang, what do you make of the change of tones, at least apparently, from Pyongyang suggesting monitoring U.S. actions when considering further reactions?
I think as everybody talks about August 21st, when the Full Eagle so-called joint U.S.-Korea joint military exercise, if it stops, or if it scales down, or if Washington doesn't bring any three major nuclear weapons machinery into Korean water, Korean area, I think the DPRK won't go further.
All right. Mr. Walsh, there are a lot of ifs, according to Professor Chang, who just came back from North Korea after a 10-day trip there. Do you think those ifs are likely to be what the U.S. having in mind?
I think there's a possibility here. I think the exercises, military exercises, at this late date, when they are slated to start on Monday, they're going forward. Now the question is, will they be the same as they typically are, in which case we will be back to the back and forth action-reaction politics of North Korea on the peninsula. But if the Americans, as your colleague says, scales them back, changes them, does something to send a signal to North Korea that they are that they're willing to pause as well, then there is a chance for dialogue. And I would also note the president's tweet this morning commending Kim Jong Un for showing patience and prudence. So there's a little signal there too. So I think we're going to get the exercises. The question will be, will they be modified in some way, maybe ways we don't even see, that only the parties see, that signals, yes, there's an opening for dialogue.
Very interesting, the word you use, which we might not be able to see, and yet the parties see. That's exactly the question, is it what kinds of actions and reactions and monitoring of what each side are having toward one another when it comes to their options for the next step, or their options for the next step of actions and reactions. Mr. Zhao.
Actually, I think even for North Korea, it would be difficult for North Korea to see what exactly happening during the exercises, because this Freedom Guardian exercise is primarily a computerized simulation exercise among the commanding posts. It's a tabletop exercise. It doesn't really involve a lot of real, live fire, soldiers in the field. So I don't think it's even possible for North Korea to precisely measure the size and the scope of the exercise and compare it with the previous year. I think what more North Korea will be monitored is actually on the American rhetoric, whether the rhetoric has been toned down.
Okay, talking about rhetoric, the rhetoric has been changing directions, at least in words. On Tuesday, Rex Tillerson, the U.S. Secretary of State, said U.S. are replacing the failed policy of strategic patience, which was a phrase used by the previous Obama administration, with a new policy of, quote, strategic accountability. So what is the difference between these two concepts? Pence, another administration official, said the strategic patience was the hope that the marshalling international support would bring an end to the nuclear ambition and the ballistic missile program of DPRK, which clearly has failed with the advent of nuclear weapons tests. Well, the strategic accountability means continue to working with its allies and partners and to hold nations accountable to their commitments to isolate the nation. Mr. Zhao, I have to go back to you. It sounds, at least from Mr. Pence's explanation, it is rather a policy toward the allies and partners, except DPRK. And yet, the previous argument is it's actually a fight between the United States and the DPRK. They are monitoring each other. They are doing actions and reactions. So will this strategic accountability really work, or is it only a sideshow to the real show?
I think it's basically a strategy of shifting burdens, outsourcing American North Korea policy to other countries, basically refusing to take its own accountability to deal with North Korea. There is even report that the U.S. is trying to convince South American countries and African countries to cut relations with North Korea. So it's part of a comprehensive strategy of isolation against North Korea. I think it could be interpreted by North Korea as a strategy similar to regime change, because it's a strategy of complete isolation and embargo.
But then, on the other hand, Mr. Walsh, Rex Tillerson said very clearly it is not about regime change after the so-called strategic accountability was being made announced. So what exactly is the purpose where the U.S. will not be able to see what exactly is the purpose of this policy?
Well, you know, I'm going to take a contrarian view here.
Go ahead.
I know they're working very hard to come up with with a phrase that's different from strategic patience because they said strategic patience is dead. But when you break down strategic patience into individual policy tools, it's sort of the same collection of things with a different name, but they're struggling mightily because they want to distinguish what they're doing from what President Obama did. That's always the core rationale for the Trump administration. I do think there is some difference, though. I mean, if President Trump manages to give a green light to new talks, resumption of the six-party talks, bilateral talks through the New York Channel, building on those, whatever. If he does that, that will be different. And that will be consistent with his announced policy review of maximum pressure and engagement. He'll be doing the engagement part of that policy, and I would welcome that. I would say, though, there are some other things he has to do. How about appointing a U.S. ambassador to South Korea, for example? You know, it's very hard to have an effective policy if you don't have your own people on the ground who represent the government. So I think there are a number of things that the Trump administration should be doing, and perhaps they'll be different than strategic patience, but it's only time will tell if that's true.
Of course, anything time will tell, but you know, when you look at the specific meanings of it, that will include the strategic accountability, rigorous enforcement of sanctions, leaving no DPRK source of revenue untouched. In particular, the U.S. will continue to request the Chinese and Russian commitments not to provide the regime with any economic lifelines and to persuade it to abandon its dangerous path, according to the White House. So exactly, that is not directing at DPRK, but rather going the other way, directing at the partners and the allies who have been working with the United States on the issue of the Korean Peninsula. This is totally different from the so-called strategic patience. Strategic patience is leaving things alone, leaving the DPRK alone, which of course has failed as well. So let me go back to you, Mr. Chung. Is this policy going to work? Because now we see war of words, at least, between DPRK and the United States, not the United States, and also U.S. partners, according to at least the other partners.
As everybody's saying, it's between DPRK and the United States in essence. What I see now is there's a real, I would say, official process to come to an end, the whole 70-year-long the USA and DPRK confrontation.
Why?
I think that Washington is trying to find ways in which they can, quote-unquote, sit directly with the DPRK. All other gestures, including military actions, in my language, it's actually show. There's no any real action will be involved, which will take us into real nuclear war. I don't think that will take place.
All right.
So it's a matter of time. The world will see very soon, sooner than later. The Washington and Pyongyang will sit down and to talk about it.
I think I understand what Professor Chung here is trying to indicate. Mr. Zhao, is Professor Chung trying to say, whatever it is, whether strategic patience, strategic accountability, strategic inaccountability, just give it a name. It's just a side show of the real show. The real show, according to Professor Chung, is Pyongyang and Washington now are working on different channels, trying to reach a possibility, consensus, best timing, not to lose face for anyone, to come up with a mechanism or timing just to talk to one another. Do you agree with that? Is that happening?
Well, I agree. I agree there is back-channel dialogue ongoing. Mr. Joseph Yun, the American North Korea policy representative, is in touching with his North Korean counterparts. However, what I'm concerned is the U.S. still doesn't have a coherent strategy, and therefore it is sending conflicting signals. On one hand, there's back-channel discussion. On the other hand, U.S. is calling for China and Russia to cut off North Korea's economic lifeline. How wouldn't that be North Korea interpreted as a strategy of?
Well, probably U.S. as the big guy, as the right. Should I say U.S. as the good guy, while China and Russia, South Korea as the bad guys.
But clearly, it's the U.S. that is asking.
Wouldn't that be interesting?
Right, but clearly, it's the U.S. that is asking China and
that
Russia.
Is looking on surface, probably somebody would reach with that conclusion. Mr. Zhao?
But I think clearly North Korea understands it's the pressure from the U.S. that is making China
I don't
Russia.
think so.
All right, Professor Chung.
I mean, when I said the all show is from Washington, Washington's all military action in my language, it's a show. I think that already, like James Clapper, U.S. will have to sit directly with the DPRK, not anymore the show going on, including so-called quote-unquote military exercises. I think the DPRK is very serious. If they bring, in my judgment, further military escalation into the Korean Peninsula, as they said, the Hwasong 12, the IRBM, I don't doubt they will not stop firing from, as they said.
All right, but
Yeah.
you may know.
As a strong message.
You may know there are counteractions coming from the United States.
Sure.
But Mr. Walsh, is making others the bad guy going to make U.S. the good guy to Pyongyang?
I don't know if good cop, bad cop really works here. I think all the countries are being driven by their own national interests, and there does seem to be a move afoot. But let me, and I agree with my colleagues, I don't think war is imminent. I don't think North Korea is going to start a war they know they're going to lose. I hope the U.S. isn't going to start a war. And so I don't think a conflict is likely, but I do think it's dangerous, in part because of what your colleague from Carnegie says, that there are lots of mixed messages going on, and because the leadership involved seems to take one view one day and another view another day. So I do think it's dangerous. I think there's an opportunity here for the parties to sort of push through and go ahead and start talks. But it would not surprise me if we're back to where we were, if we were having this conversation in another 2 weeks, and what we've had is exercises followed by a missile test, followed by strong language. We could be back in the same old quite
All
quickly.
right, Mr. Zhao, here in Beijing, we see the U.S. General Joseph Dunford in Beijing talking to his Chinese military counterpart, also meeting Chinese President Xi Jinping on Thursday. Of course, the Chinese side indicated once and again the use of force is not going to be the way to solve the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula. And yet the question is how much the U.S. side would buy that, first of all, or North Korea, rather, would buy that. And meanwhile, what would that make China a role to play? On the one hand, being pressured by the United States to put on more sanctions and further sanctions and implementation of sanctions against Pyongyang, but on the other hand, being expected by the other party as one of the sole correlators to talk to Pyongyang.
Well, as we know, one of the results of the meetings between General Fang and General Danford was the two militaries decided to start a strategic dialogue with each other. And the focus of this dialogue would be crisis management between the two militaries, making sure that if there is a contingency on the Korean Peninsula, the two militaries wouldn't misunderstand each other's intentions. And they want to have some good coordination between military actions. That means, I think, the U.S. military is seriously concerned that there might be a chance for military conflict breaking out.
Is China concerned?
I think China is concerned too. Both countries can miscalculate. U.S. and North Korea can miscalculate and stumble into a military conflict without intentionally seeking a war with each other.
I see. We are really running out of time. Before we go, one sentence only. It has to be short from every gentleman. What is your general assessment of the situation? Mr. Walsh, begin from you. One sentence only.
I'm pleased that we're at a moment of pause. I hope the parties take advantage of it, but I won't hold my breath.
All right, Professor Zhao.
Peace will be achieved by everybody's best efforts. That's I'm quite sure. Very soon.
Wow. Mr. Zhao.
Well, I'm not sure we are going to repeat this dialogue, this same talking points again, because even though we're at a moment of pause, what is upcoming is higher tensions. I'm afraid if we do not seize this last opportunity to engage, what will face us is going to be more tensions.